In today's chat about African business, I am taking us all to Addis Ababa, Bole International Airport, a story that caught my attention, the opening of a new terminal for Africa's most successful airline, Ethiopian Airlines. I thought there's a freeze on international travel, but it looks like there's no stopping Bole International Airport and Ethiopian Airlines in particular. Now, to discuss what this means, I'm joined by someone who knows aviation than most people I know. He is the global chairman of Fairfax Africa Fund, US. He is talking to us from Washington, DC. Zemedeneh Negatu, welcome and thank you very much for talking to us again.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you for having me back.
Bole International Airport is Africa's largest now. I still can't get my head around that. For those people who don't know about Bole, how would you help us understand what the story is in Ethiopian aviation?
Right. The airport reflects the success of its anchor user, which is Ethiopian Airlines. As you know, Ethiopian Airlines is by far the biggest airline in Africa and amongst one of the biggest in the world with about $4 billion in revenue, approximately 120 aircraft. So the airport's success is actually directly related to the success of Ethiopian Airlines. As you just mentioned, it is now, in terms of its capacity, with the expanded new terminal that just recently opened, it can handle approximately 22 million. Have an ambitious program beyond that. They're in the process of building a mega airport which can handle 100 million passengers per year. That's just down the road a few years, but the preparation for that is also completed. So the short answer to your question is, when you look at Bole Airport, you look at Ethiopian Airlines, how well it's done. Even during this COVID pandemic, it's probably one of just a handful of airlines in the world that neither requested nor received government bailout. So they have done, relatively speaking, well. I mean, in fact, I think they, if I'm not mistaken, they broke even for this year's financial year. So if not, maybe eked out some profit. So it has been a remarkable success over the last several years. You and I have talked about this in the past. I think it gives Africa a good branding. It shows the rest of the world that we Africans can build successful global institutions, a multinational company indigenous to Africa, but going around the world. So that's kind of the message that the success of Bole shows with Ethiopian Airlines.
But how would you summarize the reason for the success of Ethiopian Airlines, a state-owned airline where so many airlines have failed?
Right. So this actually comes up a lot in both in aviation conferences and TV programs or programs like yours that we discussed. It's very simple. I've always said it's not the ownership that matters in the success or failure of airlines. It's actually how it's run. So the Ethiopian Airlines has always been run as a business. Essentially, it has to earn its own weight. There's no backing from the government, no funding from the government. So it's over the last 70 years or so of its success, it's always been a standalone, successful business, and it thinks like a business. It competes globally as a business. So a lot of times people say, well, it's government owned. Yeah, well, Emirates is also government owned, but it's a very successful airline as well. So let's not confuse with operational efficiency and success with the ownership. There are companies privately owned that has been run into the ground. I mean, I'm sorry to say, Kenya Airways is a good example. It was majority privately owned, but it's now bankrupt. And also, of course, we have a lot of examples of state-owned carriers with no lack of financing that have gone to the ground. I mean, I think where you are is a very good example of South African Airways. It's a very wealthy country that can afford to fund it, but has been unable to run a successful airline. So the confusion between ownership and operational efficiency is always there, but I'm just saying, run it as a business, give the management, as the Ethiopian government has done for all these years, give the management the freedom to run it, to compete with the likes of Lufthansa or British Airways, and you will have a successful airline. And they've also been very, very focused. In other words, they early on in the mid-2000s, and even earlier than that, they identified the growth trajectory of the world economy, and they realized Asia was the place to be. And this is when people were doubting that. So they fly to China and India, I think like 50 times a week, 45 to 50 times a week, unheard of. It might seem obvious today. Now we have to talk about pre-COVID and COVID and post-COVID, but I think their model has been very successful. They recruit some of the best people to come work for the airline. They all are die-in-the-wool, hardcore aviation experts. They don't bring in, let's say, a CEO of a brewery to come run Ethiopian Airlines or the marketing department. They're all aviation experts, so they know the business in and out. And this is one of the failures that we've seen. Many, as you know, my team has done about 14 African airlines, aviation, capital raising, transaction advisory, and strategy. This is the example we've seen. When you do a diagnostics of failures and successes, these are some of the things that we see. Make sure it's run as a business. If not, it's a very capital intensive business, and you go out of business very quickly if you don't manage it well.
Right, Zem, let's talk about the country Ethiopia, because this would not work if the country itself was headed in the wrong direction. Again, right. It's not a country that most people have focused on, but it has been on a path under the growth and transformation program, and now particularly Vision 2025 Fast Growth Plan of the airline. What makes Ethiopians or Ethiopia so focused where we would expect it to be just another African country?
Well, it's a good point you raised. I mean, listen, first of all, to put things in perspective, Ethiopia is a very large country. It's 110 million people, right. Very diverse, geographically very diverse. So that also needs to be, and then its economy is the fourth largest in Africa in terms of aggregate GDP. Now, right. It still has a long ways to go. Its growth potential is very significant, but it is, as you said, a lot of people, some people, not a lot, but some people may not be aware of all that's going on in Ethiopia, right? Now, having said that, the airline has been around even before any African country was independent. I mean, most African countries became independent in the 60s. Ethiopian Airlines has been running since 1945. Right. 1945, remember. So I remember Mandela flew on Ethiopian Airlines, and I was very surprised to see in the cockpit there were black pilots. So it has that legacy, history of success. But to be very frank with you, until mid-2000s, the early 2004, 2003, it had a good reputation, solid technical competence and everything, but it was a small airline. Okay, it wasn't really. So what happened is they turbocharged the growth since 2004, 2005. I just need to disclose here that my firm was involved in the development of what's called the 5-year program for the transformation of Ethiopian Airlines back in 2005 to about 2010. Since then, they've actually accelerated their growth. So a lot of the growth you see is because they're focused. They've identified early on what their competitive advantage is. And you'll notice last year, Bole Airport, which we started this conversation with, became the largest gateway into and out of Africa. It took that crown from Dubai Airport. So it's because, right. As I said, they focused on where the growth is. Even today, you and I are speaking, I'm in Washington today. It's one of the very few airlines that is still flying to the United States today. Okay, it flies to Washington. So it has a focus, it has a capacity. It's been technologically, it's a pioneer. It was the launch customer for Boeing on the 787 Dreamliner. So they've always been risk takers and been able to achieve growth, both in passenger. I think this past year, they moved 12 million passengers. And then, as I said, the airport is sort of the reflection of the six. So these are just some of the reasons why Ethiopian Airlines has succeeded. Technological pioneer, a legacy of excellence going back 75 years. Let me just quickly tell you a very quick story. So it will also, when Ethiopian Airlines was started, it was started with the help of TWA, the American airline, the US carrier. Where's TWA now? It's bankrupt. It's gone out of business more than 25 years ago. But Ethiopian Airlines continues its success. So some of the legacy of the Americans brought to Ethiopia when they established, the Ethiopians just made it infinitely even better. But at least they had that initial legacy, and also of indigenization. Every Ethiopian Airlines is 100%, not only 100% Ethiopian owned, but Ethiopian run, with the exception of some expat pilots that they've hired because the growth was very significant. The CEO, the entire C-suite, the entire management, mid-level, all the way down to the MRO is 100% Ethiopians. That also made it different because it gave people ownership, it gave people a sense of belongingness. It gave, and also because it's a knowledge intensive business, knowledge could be transferred from one generation to another, which we don't see in many other African airlines. You hire a lot of expats, they come and they go, or no investment goes into the trade. They have the largest aviation academy in Africa. It not only trains Ethiopians, but it trains people, pilots, cabin crew, technicians from across Africa and beyond. So they've invested in people, and that's one of the reasons. It's a people business, by the way, because the aircrafts are tools to deliver on your services. If you don't invest in the pilots, the cabin crew, the technicians, the management, then you don't have a successful airline. And don't depend on expats or third parties to make you sustainable. You can use expats on a sprinkle basis, on where you have shortages of staff, but don't let that happen. And that's what we see in Africa is we need to build the talent from the grounds up for these airlines to be successful. The final point I wanted to make, at least on this discussion, is Africa have made it very difficult for African airlines to grow because we have rigid bilateral agreements, BASAs, as we call it, bilateral air service agreement. Now that's trying to be dismantled a little bit, but still, it's easier for a non-African carrier to fly into Africa than for an African carrier to fly from here to there. For some very good, smart ways, Ethiopian Airlines has managed to eliminate that, even though the laws are on place. Is managed, for example, in West Africa. In many African countries, it's considered to be a national flag carrier for these countries. So the governments have it, but for others, it's difficult to take off from the ground in Africa because of a lot of these regulatory. And so these are just some of the reasons.
Okay, Zem, I'm gonna talk to you when you're back in Ethiopia. I know you'll be back there in a few weeks. I appreciate your time. Zemedeneh Negatu, the businessman extraordinaire and aviation expert. He is global chairman of Fairfax Africa Fund, US. He's in Washington, DC, but he's a proud Ethiopian and a global citizen. Thank you very much, Zem, for joining us.
Thank you, Victor.